Did you know that styling your short hair the wrong way can actually make you look older? Short hair is an amazing style that gives off a youthful, energetic vibe. But if it's not styled properly, it can take away from its natural beauty and accentuate imperfections on your face. In this video, we'll share the best tips for styling short hair the right way, helping you look fresh, youthful, and confident. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. Purpose of the video. In this video, we'll walk you through 7 key styling techniques for short hair, ensuring you avoid common mistakes many people make when working with short styles. I'll also be sharing real-life examples and tips that will help you visualize and apply these techniques to your own hair with ease. Part 1. Common mistakes when styling short hair. One common mistake many people make when styling short hair is creating too much volume at the top. This can make your face look longer and give off a heavy, unbalanced appearance. Instead of enhancing your features, overdoing the volume on top can actually drag down your face, making it appear more elongated and less flattering. The key solution here is to focus on adding light volume at the roots, rather than piling it on at the top. By applying products like mousse or root lifting sprays only to the roots, you'll get the desired volume without overwhelming the shape of your face. The goal is to achieve natural lift at the base of your hair, keeping the top smooth and balanced. Remember, short hair doesn't need excessive puffiness at the top. A little lift at the roots can add plenty of volume while maintaining a clean, youthful look. By controlling the volume in the right places, you'll create a flattering, effortless style that complements your face shape and enhances your natural beauty. Cutting hair too thick around the sides of the face is a common mistake when styling short hair, especially for those with round or square faces. When the hair is too thick on the sides, it can make the face appear wider and throw off the overall balance. Excessive volume around the cheeks can create a bulky, harsh look, taking away from a soft, flattering appearance. The solution is to reduce volume on the sides and instead focus on adding light volume around the forehead and temples. This technique helps to slim the face and create balance between the top and bottom portions of the face. By adding volume to the forehead and temples, the face appears more elongated and streamlined, giving a natural, youthful look. Once you've adjusted the volume in the right places. Another key aspect of styling short hair is adding volume to the back of the hair. This keeps the overall look light and airy, preventing the hair from feeling heavy or weighed down. The hair at the back of your head, if not styled properly, can easily ruin the overall sleekness of your short haircut. When the back section isn't given the right attention, it can make your hairstyle look messy and lacking in shape, which can throw off the balance of your entire look. This is especially noticeable with short hairstyles where the back often gets overlooked or styled haphazardly. The solution is simple: keep the back of your hair neat and light, maintaining its natural flow. Instead of letting it fall flat or get tangled, use light styling products like mousse or volumizing spray to add just the right amount of lift. A blow dryer can help shape the back of your hair gently, making sure it stays soft and controlled without too much volume. This technique ensures the back of your hair looks smooth, tidy, and balanced. Once you've achieved a neat, well-styled back, the next step is focusing on the hair around your ears and face to make sure the entire hairstyle is proportionate. This step will help create the perfect balance for your short haircut. Part 2. 7 techniques for styling short hair the right way. When choosing and using the right styling products is essential for achieving the perfect short hairstyle. First, protecting your hair from heat is crucial. Heat protectant sprays or serums help minimize damage from styling tools like blow dryers, curling irons, and straighteners. Without these products, your hair can become dry, brittle, and prone to split ends after repeated exposure to high temperatures. In addition to heat protection, volumizing products play a key role in styling short hair. Mousse or foam is great for adding volume without weighing the hair down. These products not only give your hair a bouncy, full look, but also keep it light and natural, without the risk of it becoming flat or greasy. Mousse is especially useful for achieving volume that lasts throughout the day without making your hair feel stiff or heavy. Using the right styling products ensures that your short hair stays looking fresh and natural. Heat protectants shield your hair from damage, while volumizing mousse keeps your hairstyle bouncy and effortless, all without the heaviness that can make short hair look flat or limp. 2. The right technique for drying your hair is crucial to achieving natural volume, especially for short hair. One effective method is to use a blow dryer and brush your hair in a non-directional way. Instead of drying your hair in a fixed direction, this technique allows you to create volume naturally from the roots, giving your hair a bouncy, full look without it becoming flat or losing volume as it dries. This method helps maintain volume throughout the day, keeping your hair from flattening out or losing its natural lift. By using this technique, you can achieve natural volume without relying on excessive styling products. Brushing your hair in a non-directional way while drying ensures that your hair dries evenly and keeps its natural bounce, making it look lively and full of body. This technique not only helps maintain volume, but also keeps your hair looking soft and natural, avoiding the flat, lifeless look that can sometimes occur with short hair. It's a simple yet effective way to achieve a voluminous and fresh look. 3. When styling short hair. One of the best techniques for creating soft, natural bangs is using a non-directional drying method. Instead of drying your bangs in a specific direction, this technique allows for natural volume and movement, giving your hair a bouncy, effortless look. It helps avoid harsh lines and ensures your bangs don't end up stiff or flat. Drying your bangs without a fixed direction gives them a natural, voluminous finish. It keeps the hair light and flexible so you can adjust it easily throughout the day. This method allows for gentle movement, making your bangs appear soft and lively rather than rigid or overly controlled. Once your bangs are styled this way, it's also important to balance the bangs with the rest of your hair to ensure the overall look remains cohesive and flattering. This will help create a harmonious, well-rounded hairstyle that looks great from all angles. 4. When creating volume at the top of your head, it's important to maintain a light, natural look without making your hair heavy or weighed down. A common mistake is adding too much volume at the crown, which can make the hair appear stiff and unnatural. To achieve the right amount of volume, focus on creating lift from the roots without overdoing it so your hair has a soft, bouncy feel. To do this, apply volumizing products like mousse or root lifting spray directly to the roots. Then use a blow dryer with a round brush to gently lift the roots. By brushing your hair in the opposite direction, you create lift without making the top heavy or too voluminous. By adding the right amount of volume at the top, your hair will stay bouncy and full of body, without looking flat or weighed down. This technique gives your hair a natural, light, and effortlessly styled appearance. 5. Creating light volume on the sides of your face is key to achieving balance and enhancing your facial features. To avoid making your face look wider or out of proportion, reduce the volume on the sides and focus on adding volume to the forehead and temples. This helps slim the face, accentuate your cheekbones, and create a more harmonious, elongated appearance. By adding volume to the forehead and temples, you not only create balance but also make your face appear more slender and defined. Use products like mousse or volumizing sprays focusing on the forehead and temples, and then dry your hair with a blow dryer, brushing against the natural direction of growth to add subtle lift. This technique creates natural volume without making the sides of your hair appear heavy or bulky. Reducing volume on the sides and adding light volume to the forehead and temples will give your hair a more balanced, youthful, and flattering look. 6. Using wax to add texture and style is an excellent technique for creating natural movement in short hair without making it sticky or heavy. Wax provides a strong hold, helping to maintain your hairstyle throughout the day while keeping your hair soft and flexible. It's the perfect product to add thickness and life to your hair, especially for short styles that need flexibility and movement. To use wax effectively, apply a small amount to your fingers, warm it up, and then work it through your hair from the tips to the roots. This helps create natural movement, giving your hair volume without making it greasy or weighed down. Wax is ideal for adding texture to short hair while maintaining softness and bounce. Wax not only helps your hairstyle stay in place, but also creates a lively, bouncy look, making your hair appear full of style and energy. 7. When styling your hair. Improving the look from the side view is crucial for highlighting the facial features and creating a more elongated, graceful appearance. To achieve this, focus on keeping the hair at the back of your neck sleek and tidy, avoiding excess bulk or a horizontal line that could make your face look shorter. By lifting the hair at the back, you can create the illusion of a longer neck and enhance the overall balance of your face. To do this, keep the back hair neat while adding light volume at the roots in the front. This not only elongates the neck, but also highlights your jawline and facial features, giving you a sleek and refined look. Creating the right shape from the side view helps your face appear slimmer and longer, while accentuating the natural beauty and elegance of your features. Part 3. Real-life stories and examples. One Charlene came to me with short hair that looked flat and lifeless. Her hair lacked natural volume, and overall the style appeared tired and lackluster. After applying techniques like adding light volume at the roots, using the non-directional drying method, and applying mousse for lift, her hair became much more vibrant, natural, and youthful. Her hair now has bounce, light volume, and a soft, natural look, enhancing her facial features and making her appear fresh and rejuvenated. Once the hair becomes lively and natural, the next step is to maintain that bounce and volume throughout the day. One of my clients had a pixie cut, but her hair often lacked texture and natural movement. After using wax to create texture, her hair became much more lively and stylish. The wax provided hold and allowed for natural movement, giving her hair volume without weighing it down. This not only made her hair look more beautiful, but also made her face appear slimmer and more youthful, highlighting her features in a balanced way. Using wax not only creates natural movement in the hair, but also helps maintain light volume without making the hair feel stiff or heavy. It's a great way to keep the hairstyle looking fresh and dynamic throughout the day. Styling your short hair the right way doesn't just help you look younger, it boosts your confidence in any situation. Choosing the right products and techniques is crucial to making sure your short hair not only looks great, but also complements your face and personal style. Give the techniques I've shared a try and see the difference for yourself. If you have short hair, don't be afraid to experiment and find the method that works best for you. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Leave your thoughts or questions in the comments below. I'm here to help.